Now, some would say that blaxploitation horror movies are a subgenre and not a microgenre, but I think that they might be including modern movies that pay tribute to that era of the 70s when these films were being made. Movies like Bones by Snoop Dogg, or Black Devil Doll, Death by Temptation, or Snoop Dogg's Hood of Horror starring Snoop Dogg. They also include movies that have elements of the blaxploitation experience, like a prominent African-American actor, like Scatman Crothers from The Shining, or Dwayne Jones in Night of the Living Dead, where race was actually used for both powerful and chilling effect. But today, we're going to be looking at the first generation of original, authentic, pure, distilled essence of the genre. And with only 11 titles, I would count that as a microgenre. It should be pointed out that there's a level of analysis to these movies that I'm not going to be the best representative of. Considerations that some of these films were greenlit or funded because they portrayed a black lead as a monster instead of a human, or that portrayals of black culture on screen are somewhat forced by white expectations of black culture, or exaggerating or framing black culture in unflattering ways, like they all largely utilize voodoo and how that's portrayed on screen, or the amount of pimps and emulating pimps, which did have a big influence on hip-hop. If that kind of social analysis is something that you're interested in, I would suggest watching Horror Noir, which is a great documentary covering the entire history of black people's involvement in horror movies over the years, commented on by black actors and directors involved in those productions. So, Horror Noir, check it out. The only commentary that I would like to add here is that whether or not somebody has a valid criticism of parts of these films is not as important as their existence in history, and that for good or bad, they paved the way for everything that came after. So for any faults that they have, they're still integral to our culture. These films are the roots of a tree that bears fruit like The New Candyman and Get Out, and we all want more great movies like that getting made. So what are the rules? All the movies we cover today will have come out between 1972 and 1978, just 6 years, so predominantly black cast, horror movie subject matter, and came out in the 70s. Let's get to it. Now, people would and should probably assume that I would start this list with Blacula, but in 1972 was also the year that The Twilight People came out, and many people add this movie to their blaxploitation horror list, probably because it has Pam Grier in it, but she plays a minor role, and the rest of the movie is actually a Filipino horror movie directed by cult favorite Eddie Romero. We could do an entire video series on Eddie Romero films, and maybe one day I will, but it doesn't really belong on this list. The one other reason that I wanted to at least mention it is that Twilight People is an intentional remake of The Island of Dr. Moreau, which could also have its own video in the future, but this is a recurring theme on this list. The movie is a black version of a classic horror story. Black Dracula, Black Frankenstein, Black Island of Dr. Moreau, and so on. So it doesn't really fit, but it's close enough to mention, and I mentioned it. So that wasn't really the list yet, but this is going to be the real list now. Blacula is arguably the definitive black horror movie. It sets up the Black Dracula, Black Frankenstein trope that's emulated in concept or title in 8 out of these 11 movies. William Marshall, it has to be said, is the guy doing all the heavy lifting in this movie. His gravitas, his sheer size, reminds me very much of Christopher Lee, that menacing power and elegance that's all put together. Plus, it stars the guy with the baddest name in the game.
Thalamus Rasulallah.
And you really gotta say it like...
Thalamus Rasulallah.
Blackenstein was quickly released the next year in 1973 as a cheap, obvious copy of not really Frankenstein, but of what Blacula had done, and yet it fails to bring any of that charisma or charm from that movie. Instead, the movie's clearly geared to make a quick buck. The budget isn't there, and the music and sound is abrasive, the story's plodding, makeup effects leaving you wanting. This one was not my favorite. If I had to sum up the experience of watching it with one shot, it would be this one. The producer of the film Frank Soletri had also produced Blacula and was an attorney who was murdered years later under unfortunate circumstances, tortured with a screwdriver in his house and shot in the head, a crime that is still unsolved. But he also had other scripts that were ready to go that never saw the light of day, including Black the Ripper. I'm assuming an exploitation take on Jack the Ripper. Would it have been any good, though? I have no idea.
I know it was the blood. Oh, I know it was the blood.
Ganja and Hess in 1973 is our first movie on the list without black in the title, unless you saw it under its alternative titles, Black Evil, Black Vampire, or Blackout, Moment of Terror. It was also known as Vampires in Harlem. No offense to Blacula, but I think it's fair to say that this is our first serious entry, at least the first entry to take itself seriously. This is like an art house type movie. Director Bill Gunn didn't want to make a vampire movie, perhaps assuming that he was going to be asked to make something like Blacula or Blackenstein, and so instead he used vampirism as a metaphor and made the real theme of the movie addiction. This is the only other movie that Dwayne Jones was the lead in, the other being Night of the Living Dead, of course. I would say that this is a movie with an artistic vision, but it's not a fun movie. It has many jangling, droning audio passages that are intentionally dissonant, maybe to illustrate the madness in the scenes, or an echoing psychedelic soundscape that are effective but also incredibly draining to sit through. At least it was for me. There are also two different cuts of this movie, one that Bill Gunn saw as his final vision of the film, and the other is a shortened version that the financiers wanted to put out in the theaters, but it's more interesting than the usual slash and burn that studios would do when such edits happen.
Bill Gunn, Chiz Schultz go in with this finished screenplay and get permission to make that as the movie. On the set, various inspirations, new ideas, new directions present themselves. And during the editing process, Gunn and Victor Konevsky really go with this idea and lend the film a completely new flavor, something far more abstract, more artistic, more challenging to the audience than what had been written. When Heritage Enterprises gets Fima Novak to come in and recut the movie, basically what he does is take footage that Bill Gunn had written, that Bill Gunn had directed, that the various actors had performed on the set with Bill Gunn and Chiz Schultz and everybody else watching and approving. They take that footage and uses that to turn the movie back into the thing that Gunn had originally set out to make.
So it's not just cut for length or to compromise the original concept for the film or defy what was in the script either. Interesting. Ganja and Hess was remade in 2014 by Spike Lee as The Sweet Blood of Jesus, which doesn't quite meet up to the original, even though it does a pretty good job. It's filled with long music video style passages that pad out the 2-hour runtime. The movie is slower than scary, though there are some great moments of horror in parts in the film. But there are also parts where one music track ends and the next starts without a break, and it can be incredibly effective or it can be unintentionally distracting. While it strikes an interesting tone of its own, the more important film to see is the original. More interesting than the film itself is that this remake was the first crowd-funded production for Spike Lee, and that's pretty cool. Watching the film, you can see that there's an uncompromised vision of Lee's on the screen, outside of a studio system, for better or for worse. The sequel to Blacula was quickly produced and released the very next year. I would suspect people were skeptical that this phenomenon of horror movies expressed through black culture, or what we were given as black culture at the time, was going to last, so they probably just churned this one out really fast. You can see it in the final product somewhat as well. But it's not a total loss, it's just a step down. William Marshall does return as Blacula, who really is their best special effect, and Pam Grier joins the cast in this one. The plot brings in the voodoo element, which becomes common in these films. Some reviews would paint this as one of the worst that blaxploitation films had to offer, but Blacula meets Pam Grier is all you need to make a classic film, and indeed there are many, myself included, who enjoy the film. It's not reinventing the wheel, but who said it had to? Okay, and 1 year after that, 1974, an Abbey gets released. Guess who's back again? The great William Marshall, Blacula himself, the leading icon of this microgenre. This time out he plays a priest in this very Exorcist-style entry. Now, as a side note to any Star Trek fans that are out there, William Marshall also played Dr. Richard Daystrom in the 1967 episode of Star Trek, The Ultimate Computer. The Daystrom Institute is actually a facility on Earth dedicated to science that reappears in multiple Star Trek series. Data spent time there. Geordi created the jellyfish, which merged regular Star Trek universe with the Abrams universe. 7 of 9 accepts a position there in Picard. So how cool is it that it's named after Blacula, right? Okay. Back to Abbey. This movie is one of the harder to find titles on this list. It doesn't have a current physical release, and many versions online are scanned from an old VHS source, but it has all the moments you'd expect from a Black Exorcist movie. The deep male voice, the potty mouth, it's all there. At the time of the release, the obvious similarities between it and the actual Exorcist movie got the movie shelved for many years, despite making plenty of money in theaters and being generally well received by audiences.
I want to thank you for calling that mother
Thalamus Rasulala.
and when he arrives, give him my worst regards and tell him I'll be waiting for him.
Supernatural voodoo woman, do her own and you want.
Sugar Hill is the blaxploitation zombie movie, but maybe the most interesting part of this title is that the zombies are pre-Romero zombies, and what I mean by that is they are voodoo zombies resurrected and controlled by black magic, which is how zombies had been depicted before Romero created the modern zombie.
Zombies. Yes, they are my servants.
It's also questionable as to why you would name a zombie movie Sugar Hill.
He said, well, from now on, you're going to be called Sugar. Miss Sugar Hill. Because you look as sweet as sugar tastes.
Well, that's nice, but it should have been something like Black Night of the Zombies or Black Dawn of the Dead. I guess that wouldn't have come out yet. Even just Black Zombie. Sure, they're not any less gaudy or stupid titles than the other cheesy titles on this list, but I bet they would have sold better to the horror fans. Actually, this is something that somebody noticed as well, because when it was cut for TV, it was retitled Zombies of Sugar Hill. Similarly, the lead actress was alright, but I could have easily seen Pam Grier play that role. It's basically the same role she played in Scream Blacula Scream as a voodoo priestess, but this time she's resurrecting an army of the dead to exact revenge on those who killed her man. American International Pictures had previously made Blacula and its sequel, which featured Pam Grier, and this was their last attempt at this cross-genre niche. I wonder if they planned on getting Pam, because the actress who ended up with the role, Betty Ann Reese, looks like she's cosplaying Coffee the entire time, and this many decades later, it's a cult favorite. In my opinion, a pop culture icon like Pam Grier having her name attached probably would have given this movie a little bit more attention, relevance, or exposure. The voodoo zombies are dusty and covered in cobwebs, but their defining feature is these big silver orbs that they have in their eyes designed for them. It's a decent effort, some cool parts, but mostly an average product in the end that just needed like one more element, something to push it a little further.
I am the dirty!
Maybe if they got Mac from Night Court and had him trapped in a zombie massage and massaged to death. Oh wait, they did.
Stop it!
The House on Skull Mountain came out in 1974, and most would consider this mid to low tier in this genre, but I personally like it a fair bit. There's some visual photography that's cool, and the characters, while a little bit flat and stock or one-dimensional, they also have a few good moments. Another entry on the list with a voodoo-centric theme, but this is a haunted house story, so I feel as though House on Skull Mountain is to House on Haunted Hill what Blacula is to Dracula. 5 estranged cousins meet at the house of their estranged rich and now dead grandmother to see who will get the inheritance.
Miss Johnson, this is your cousin, Mr. Philip Willard. Miss Harriet Johnson.
Yeah, what's happening, Harriet? Yeah. Also, you dig the scene?
But they're picked off one at a time. Some of the model shots are not entirely convincing, and the deaths aren't particularly clever or gruesome, but the poster's pretty great. Directed by Blacula director William Crane in 1976, Dr. Black and Mr. Hyde should have been a more entertaining movie than we got. Bernie Casey in the lead meant the talent was there, but I think because it took itself too seriously for an idea that's campy at best, especially with that title, that maybe audience expectations were left unfilled. Maybe this is because despite the fact that Blacula is now a cult favorite when it came out, it was panned by critics, leaving me to wonder if that made Crane pull back on the more theatrical and camp aspects that he was criticized for previously. The plot is basically a retread of Jekyll and Hyde's story, with the main characters as a doctor trying to find a cure for cirrhosis of the liver and making the decision to try out his experimental medicine on himself with unexpected side effects. Or expected side effects if you title your movie after a well-known horror classic. And so, knowing the expectation, perhaps it was an intentional choice to downplay the transformation sequences. Especially in the monster sequences, the makeup could have been so much more fun, so even if it was ridiculous and over the top, it would have at least been more entertaining. And the Hyde performance by Casey seems the most subdued and restrained instead of manic and wild. Trying to play it straight is okay if you've got something more to say. There's a bit about his mother being a prostitute, and then he goes out murdering women, but it's not that much to dig into, at least what we get on screen, what they've given us. It's a little more implied, I guess. Whether you appreciate the attempt to play it straight or wanted a campier, over-the-top cartoon of a movie, there's not much argument in whether or not the final product is very good. Even in its look, there's scenes that just make the actors look ghastly or undead, and it's hard to imagine that this was an intentional choice. Okay. JD's Revenge, 1976. This is a pretty damn good and creepy horror flick, where the ghost of J.D. Walker, a dead pimp, starts to manifest himself through our leading man, Ike, and the more we see J.D., the more he takes over Ike's behavior, becoming violent and abusive with his lady, changing his hair and his clothes. The performances need to sell this movie, and they do not let you down. In many ways, you could look at this movie as another turn on the Jekyll and Hyde story, but if we wanted to keep in the vein of comparisons to other classics, Black Dracula, Black Frankenstein, Black Exorcist, Black House on Haunted Hill, Black Jekyll and Hyde, this might be more of like the Black Shining.
There he is, a dead bitch. Yeah, I do. Open this goddamn door. I'll kill your ass, please. Oh, God. The
way that the ghost of JD takes over Ike slowly, and how raw and powerful his performance is, how genuinely creepy the movie gets.
What in the world have you done to yourself?
What's the matter, baby? Don't you like your daddy's calm, huh?
Of course, that's not really possible to say that it's an homage of The Shining, because The Shining wouldn't be released for another 4 years, but you can see how the similarity is there. At the time of making this film, it was only Glenn Turman's second role as a lead, his first being in Cooley High, which is a completely different kind of film. Kudos to him for making the film, giving it even more authenticity with his talent. This was a tour de force performance, and it makes the movie what it is. JD's Revenge deserves much more love and attention, in my opinion.
Yes, I'm Petey Wheatstraw, the devil's son-in-law. I'm not here to brag, nor here to boast. I can sit on a tombstone and produce baby ghosts.
Another favorite that I'm throwing in here is Petey Wheatstraw, The Devil's Son-in-Law from 1977. This is a Rudy Ray Moore movie, and as serious and sinister as JD's Revenge was, Petey Wheatstraw is a fun romp with the devil. I could have overlooked this movie as a comedy, but it's often listed as a horror, and it does have some darker elements and gruesome violence that would qualify it. But I really wanted to keep this on the list because I feel like whenever Rudy Ray Moore is mentioned, it's mostly in the context of Dolomite, which is fair. But when you consider that the Rudy Ray Moore canon is only 4 movies, the first 2 are Dolomites, the last is The Disco Godfather, which is a bit of a misstep, then Petey Wheatstraw, The Devil's Son-in-Law, deserves more spotlight, being the only other movie, really, that he did. Rudy plays Petey, who after being gunned down at his brother's funeral, makes a deal with the devil to come back and get his revenge in exchange for marrying the devil's daughter. Of course, Petey's gonna try and outsmart Old Scratch, and we're gonna see how that goes. This movie has a touch of the Robert Johnson deal with the devil, down at the crossroads vibe to it, wrapped in a Rudy Ray Moore rhyme scheme, and honestly, I think it's gotta be one of the main inspirations for the Black Dynamite animated series, with characters looking like they've been lifted whole cloth from this film.
If we don't pay him back, we're dead, partner, we're dead. What we gonna do, Leroy? What we gonna do? Shut up and let me think!
And with so many of the movies on this list being a black twist on an already established classic story, special emphasis should be given to movies like Petey Wheatstraw, Ganja and Hess, and JD's Revenge that are true originals. The final movie on this list is as questionable as the first regarding whether or not it even belongs on the list at all. It's consistently listed as a blaxploitation horror movie on various lists, despite there only being 2 black actors in the film and neither is the main lead. Even the director is white. The movie's about a nurse who's possessed by the spirit of a cult member whose leader dies during a ritual attempting to resurrect him. He ends up in Sherry, wreaking havoc. So the horror aspects were never in question, but the 2 key points that keep this on the list are, 1, it's listed in Blaxploitation Cinema, a reference guide, even though I would argue that Night of the Living Dead could be credibly added to the list, being more important culturally on race issues with a more iconic, powerful African-American lead, and Night of the Living Dead isn't in the book. And second is that it was released in some theaters as Black Voodoo, which is as misleading a title as it is stupid as it is exploitative. So it's on the list. The budget is nothing, the special effects are something tied to a shoestring, but the movie ends up being more fun than it deserves. And that's it. That's the whole list. As I mentioned before, the genre is survived by loving tributes like Bones, Snoop Dogg's Hood of Horrors, Death by Temptation, an entire trilogy of Tales from the Hood movies, and the 2 recent sequels in that series, by the way, are surprisingly savage fun. So maybe that could be a future episode. See you next week.